Hello. Recent geopolitical issues between European countries and America have brought into focus the oft repeated shared values debate. The assumption in most circles being that all the countries in the Western Bloc have some shared values that has brought them together. Was this ever the case? If so, have things changed now? What exactly were these shared values? Individual liberty? Freedom? What else? A democratic society? Were these shared values important? Were they necessary for development of the economy or for peace in society? Now let us consider some facts. Globalization, with the US as a backstop, buying stuff from all over the world, was an important phenomenon over the last 30 years. A sort of a new world order was created at the time, and the belief was democracy, which is a common to the Western civilization, was considered a good thing and necessary for development, which of course proved not to be true in many cases. China, for example, developed quite well without necessarily having a democratic society. It had more of a controlled economy and controlled society and still does. So, the shared values debate, which is considered in the Western Bloc, which is considered essential for the development, that was probably meant to solidify the Western societies into a bloc, an economic and political bloc. It served a great purpose for about 50, 60 years after the end of the Second World War, and specifically after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, the shared values of liberty, rule of law, etc., was considered essential for development, which also proved to be naive assumption. There are a lot of countries that do quite well without necessarily a strong rule of law. There are a lot of countries that do well and develop well economically and otherwise without having a democratic system at all. So, that shared value, which is meant to be that engine that made the Western Bloc develop and progress, was good for them, but was necessarily a requirement for development, it seems. A NATO led security architecture seems to be part of the shared value in the sense that it helped them consolidate the and brought about a commonality into the Western security paradigm. A Western bloc of countries that shared value under a NATO umbrella somehow seemed like a nice theme. Now, have the shared values come to the end of the road? Have those values changed and have countries drifted apart? Recent geopolitical developments indicate that the European countries are sort of drifting apart from America. Is that a temporary phenomenon? And are there enough shared values to sort of overcome this current status of affairs? Let us think about it. So, have the values changed in America, or has the values changed in Europe? Or has America just changed its values to such an extent that it's not shared as much anymore with European countries? So, talking about shared values, most Americans want lower taxes, lower regulations, and lower prices. Is that what Europeans want anymore? I don't think they ever wanted lower regulations or lower taxes. Clearly, those are not shared values. It does not seem that Europe wants to be that similar to the US society. Europeans want more regulations, more freebies, and often clamp down on information or speech that they don't approve of. So much for freedom of expression in a lot of places in Europe. The European bureaucracy, the EU bureaucracy, which countries, with the European countries decided to coalesce into and gave up their own sovereignty to some extent. They gave up the power to make laws to the Council of European Union. That is something most Americans do not like or understand, or probably never shared the need for it. And also, the left-leaning policies of most EU countries, with major focus on environmental issues, is another issue which Americans see EU as being extreme, and they don't share those values to that extent anymore. The cozying up with Islamic militants in some cases and being soft on crime committed by some Islamists is probably another thing that rankles Americans. The inability to condemn Islamic terrorism for fear of domestic repercussions is another pusillanimous approach of EU, which most Americans don't like. So has Europe changed its values too much, much to the chagrin of the Americans? The American politicians have stopped looking at UK, for example, as a mothership from where they were launched. That was a very common sentiment for a long time. So one thing to keep in mind is the left-leaning intellectuals from the Ivy Leagues in the US, and probably from some of the leaders in California, they were the leading globalists with the global leftist agenda, setting narratives that kind of demonized others that did not subscribe to their policies. For example, they also demonized societies and people and groups that didn't subscribe to the wokeness or to the Marxist-influenced so-called progressive movements that others did not necessarily subscribe to. So to the extent that the EU countries swallowed all these left-leaning narratives from the Ivy Leagues, and probably those that originated in California, those, to the extent that they subscribed to it in Europe, those were the shared values for about a decade or two. Now, if that seems to be passe, then do we have less shared values going forward? With the visible changes in America, especially since President Trump took power, the Trump phenomenon, such Ivy League-led left-leaning policies and narratives have been jettisoned to some extent. Now, what was shared was a love for such left-wing narratives for a long time between Europe and America, espoused and promoted actively by the Ivy Leagues, for example, by the campuses, and maybe by some NGOs too. That kind of shared value is probably coming to an end, at least for a while. So the European countries may now see themselves as sort of victims being left alone, and the US as the oppressor probably. That's once the US stops paying for the follies of European countries, probably they'll start believing that the US is an oppressor. You never know. That will be kind of hilarious turn of events. So what about the shared values among Americans themselves? America as a society seems split, rather with significant differences between political views, political leanings. There is less of a cohesion, it seems. It is not about, so why would that impact the relationship with Europe? If one faction of the political groupings in the US has aligned with Europe, doesn't necessarily mean when the other faction comes into power that alignment is lost to some extent and the values seem diluted, those that are shared. So could it be that the current drift in American and European geopolitical outlooks is not really about shared values? Could it be that the end of the day that America under President Trump is just cutting its losses? A bit of it, it's cutting down its costly commitments to Europe and reorienting its security structures, seeing EU and Europe as a place not needing that much help or that much of a security umbrella going forward, and sort of cutting down the investment of time and energy and the share with Europe, so much so that Europe starts suspecting that the shared values are rather diluted now. Europe is still a good market for American trade. American economy sells a lot of stuff to Europe and buys a lot of stuff too. As a trading bloc, EU is quite big, at least for now. Still a good market for US armaments and industrial goods and new technologies. So trading with Europe is going to continue despite this debate of shared values. But withdrawing of its security umbrella by America could be the method going forward. We might not share the umbrella. We might share some of the values, give or take a few. It might get diluted, get stronger when the winds of political change come about. But primarily is the change going forward, it seems, is more trade oriented, security relationship oriented, and the debate of shared value just camouflages some of those differences. So it's fun, nevertheless, to keep that in mind.